She tore the deed in half before the ink was dry on her husband's grave marker. Stood on her own porch, looked Gerald Hatch dead in both eyes, and dropped the pieces at his boots. "Tell Croft," she said, "that a widow's signature isn't something you steal off a grieving woman's kitchen table." They thought she'd break. They thought 80 acres and a dead husband, and no money for lawyers would be enough to fold her. They had never once in their lives met a woman like Lily Calloway. If this story already has your blood up, subscribe, watch to the very end, and tell me what city you're watching from. The boots on her porch came on a Monday. Daniel had been in the ground 4 days. Lily heard them before she saw them 3 sets. Heavy and unhurried, the boots of men who have never once in their lives had to wonder whether they were welcome somewhere. She was at the kitchen sink, with her hands in cold water and her eyes on the window above it, and she did not move when she heard them. Just lifted her chin and watched the reflection in the glass resolve into 3 shapes on her porch steps. She dried her hands. She went to the door. She opened it before they could knock, which she did deliberately, because there are small ways of telling a man he does not have the power he thinks he has, and opening your own door on your own terms is one of them. Gerald Hatch was in the middle. She knew him by description: small eyes, wide forehead, the kind of smile that lives on a man's face the way a tool lives in a drawer, ready to be used when needed. The 2 men flanking him were hired weight, the human equivalent of a signature on a document that says, "This is serious, and we are prepared to make it more so." "Mrs. Calloway." Hatch tipped his hat. "We're sorry for your loss." "No, you're not." She kept one hand on the door frame. "What do you want?" The smile adjusted. Not disappearing, just recalibrating. "The county has been reviewing property holdings in the Raven Hollow district. Given your husband's passing, there are some questions about the legal standing of this deed. My husband homesteaded this land 18 years ago. There are no questions. There are always questions, ma'am, when a deed was registered under a single man's name and that man has since passed." Lily looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the 2 men behind him, reading them the way a woman reads, men who are paid to be present: their eyes, their hands, the particular stillness of people waiting for permission to do something. She looked back at Hatch. "My name is Lily Calloway. His name was Daniel Calloway. We were married 16 years. This is my land." Hatch reached into his leather satchel and produced a folded document. He held it out with the patient confidence of a man who has done this before and knows how it ends. "The county is prepared to offer a fair settlement. 40 cents on the acre." She took the document out of his hand. She looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she tore it in half, bent down, and placed both pieces on the porch boards at his boots. "Tell Croft," she said, "that a widow's signature isn't something you steal off a grieving woman's kitchen table." She straightened. "Get off my porch." Hatch did not move immediately. The smile was gone now, fully and completely, and what was underneath it was not anger. Anger would have been almost reassuring, but the blank, recalculating expression of a man adjusting his approach. "Mrs. Calloway, I'd encourage you to think very carefully. A woman alone running 80 acres, I said get off my porch." She closed the door. She stood with her back against it and her eyes on the ceiling, and she breathed 1 breath, 2, 3, and listened to the boots retreat down the steps. When the sound of their horses faded down the road, she pushed off the door and went back to the kitchen sink and gripped the edge of it with both hands until her knuckles went white. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear. She catalogued it carefully because she needed to know the difference, not grief, not the particular exhaustion of 4 days of not sleeping well in a house that was too quiet. Fury, clean and specific and completely without confusion about its target. Good, she thought. Fury she could use. Silas Croft had been acquiring land in the Raven Hollow Valley for 4 years. Not loudly, not with any announcement of intention. He did it the way water moves through stone, patiently, finding the cracks, working them slowly until the structure gave. He had bought out 11 families in that time. Some had sold because they were tired, because the altitude and the isolation and the relentless physical work of mountain farming had ground them down to a point where a man with money and a reasonable offer looked like relief. Some had sold under pressures they couldn't name in court. 2 had lost their land entirely through paperwork deed discrepancies, registration errors, inheritance disputes that moved through the county system with the convenient speed of cases that have someone invested in their outcome. The county land office had become, over 4 years, something other than a county land office. Lily did not know all of this when she stood at her kitchen sink on the Monday morning after Hatch left her porch. She knew fragments, the Henderson family, gone 18 months ago, something vague about the Marsh property, a neighbor's offhand comment about the land office changing hands that she hadn't followed because she'd had a sick husband to care for, and 80 acres to manage and no spare attention for valley gossip. But she was paying attention now. She went to the sheriff's office that afternoon. Roy Dunbar was a lean man who had held the job for 11 years, which in Raven Hollow meant he had learned the precise calibration of how much trouble was worth making and how much was worth absorbing. He was not a cruel man. He was something that Lily had come to recognize as more dangerous than cruelty in men who held authority. He was convenient. "I understand your concern, Mrs. Calloway. I don't need you to understand my concern. I need you to tell Gerald Hatch that if he comes back to my property without a court order, I'll consider it trespassing." Dunbar turned his hat in his hands, a gesture she would come to know well. The physical tick of a man who has an answer he doesn't want to give. "The county assessor has the legal right to." "The county assessor does not have the right to offer me 40 cents an acre for land that appraised at 230 last spring." Her voice was steady and precise. "That is not assessment. That is an opening bid on a theft." Dunbar's hands stilled on the hat brim. "You should speak to a lawyer," he said. "There's one in 4 days' ride, I know. It costs more than I have in cash. You know that too. Hatch knows it. Croft knows it." She leaned forward slightly. "Do you know it, Sheriff?" His jaw tightened. He set the hat on the desk and looked at it. "There's not much I can do about a legal land review. Then I'll handle it myself." She walked out. Behind her, she heard Dunbar not get up from his chair, which told her everything she needed to know about how much help would come from that direction. The afternoon was clear and cold, and the mountains above the valley were very sharp against the sky, the kind of sharp that happens in summer when the air hasn't yet thickened with heat. She stood outside the sheriff's office for a moment and looked at the main street of Raven Hollow, the general store, the feed barn, the harness shop, the saloon that didn't pretend to keep civil hours, and made herself see it clearly. The town knew. She could feel it in the way people moved, the slight adjustments of trajectory when they saw her, the nods that were half a degree shorter than ordinary friendliness, the quality of not quite meeting her eyes, that was not rudeness but its own kind of message. They knew what Croft was doing, and they were afraid. And afraid people in small towns develop an elaborate unconscious choreography of appearing to not notice the thing they are all absolutely aware of. She had grown up in a town like this. She had left it at 22 because she hated how it felt to live inside that choreography. She was standing inside it again, and she refused to pretend otherwise. Mrs. Teller at the general store wrapped her flour without looking up. "You'll want to be careful," she said quietly. "I'm always careful." More careful than that, a pause. "Croft bought the Hendersons out last fall. They didn't want to sell." "What happened to them?" Mrs. Teller looked at the door, then at her hands. "They sold. Lily paid and left." She was 3 steps from the store when she saw the man in the alley beside the harness shop. He was perhaps 40 broad through the shoulders, with a rangy economy of build underneath, the kind of man the work has stripped down to what's essential. His hands were a blacksmith's hands, heavy at the knuckle, permanently marked by heat and iron. He had come out of the alley and stopped when he saw her, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not pity, not curiosity, not the careful non-seeing of everyone else on the street. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he is deciding about. Then he turned and walked toward the north end of town, toward the mountain trail, without a word. She did not know his name. She did not forget his face. Hatch came back on the 3rd day. Alone this time, which was a different kind of threat from the first visit. Men like Hatch came alone when they were delivering the message that lives underneath the official message, the one that says we have moved past courtesy and into consequence. She met him at the fence line. She did not open the gate. "The county has filed a formal inquiry into your deed registration," he said. He had a new document, thicker, more official looking, folded with more care than the first one. "There are irregularities in the original homestead filing, specifically with the lot line descriptions along the northern boundary." "What irregularities?" "The perf from 1870 references a creek marker that doesn't appear in subsequent county records. Without that marker, the northern boundary is legally contested." She looked at him. Something cold and clarifying moved through her, not surprise. because she had spent 2 evenings going through Daniel's papers since the first visit, learning the shape of what she had, and she had noticed that the northern boundary description in Daniel's original homestead filing was extremely specific, with a granite creek marker referenced 3 separate times. "The creek marker exists," she said. "I have walked to it. The county's current records don't reflect it." "Then the county's current records are wrong," or Hatch said, with the patience of a man who has had this conversation before and knows how to move through it. "The original filing contained an error. These things happen. The county is simply following legal process to resolve the discrepancy." "And how does that process resolve?" "The disputed boundary area, roughly 30 acres along the northern section, would revert to county management pending resolution." She understood the math immediately. The way you understand something when you have been doing the arithmetic in the back of your mind since the first visit, without letting yourself look at it directly. 30 acres along the northern section was the creek access. Without the creek access, the remaining 50 acres had significantly reduced value and no reliable water for the upper pasture. Without reliable water, she couldn't run cattle through the summer. Without cattle, she had no income that the bank would respect. Without income, the bank would not extend her existing note. Without the note extension, she would have, at best estimate, 18 months before she was out of options. Croft didn't need to take her land outright. He just needed to take 30 acres and wait. "You manufactured a discrepancy," she said. "The county identified an existing discrepancy." His voice was smooth and practiced. "We're simply off my land." Her voice went very quiet, very flat. "The specific register that is past anger, past argument, past everything except the fundamental fact of what she intended. Mr. Hatch, I am going to tell you something and I need you to take it back to whoever sent you word for word. I have buried my husband, and I have shaken hands with the bank, and I have sat in that house and worked out exactly how many seasons I can run this property alone. I know what you're doing. I know what it's designed to do. And I am telling you now, clearly. So there's no confusion later. I will not be worked down to surrender. I will find every piece of documentation that exists about what has been done to the deeds in this valley, and I will find someone to stand up with me. And when I do, the name Silas Croft is going to be attached to a federal fraud complaint that will follow him for the rest of his life." Hatch had gone very still. It was the word federal. She had guessed at the railroad connection from a half-sentence of Mrs. Teller's and the direction of Croft's acquisitions, and Hatch's stillness confirmed it the way a man's flinch confirms where the bruise is. "Good day, Mrs. Calloway." He left. She stood at the fence until he was gone. Then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands and shook, not crying, just shaking. The physical release of a body that has held itself rigid for a confrontation and is now doing the honest accounting of what that cost. It took about 2 minutes. Then she lifted her face and pressed her palms flat on the table and began to think seriously about who in Raven Hollow she could trust. The list was short. Pastor Henning, principled, old, without influence. Mrs. Teller, afraid but not without conscience. Frank Aldro, to the south, sympathetic, cautious, with a family to protect. And the man from the alley. Caleb Anderson, Pastor Henning said. He was sweeping his church steps with the unhurried thoroughness of a man, for whom sweeping is also thinking. Runs the old Denning Forge, North Trail, half-hour up the mountain. What kind of man? Quiet. Capable. Lost his family some years back. I don't know the whole of it. He's never offered it. Works the forge, helps where he can, doesn't overcharge. A pause. Does what he says he'll do. That's rarer than it ought to be. Has Croft approached him? Caleb doesn't own land. Just leases the forge from a widower who went east. Nothing there worth Croft's attention, which means he has nothing to lose, which also means he has no reason to help you. Henning looked at her over his broom. Are you going up? Yes, then be straight with him. He has no patience for sideways conversations. She went up. The forge was half an hour's climb on the North Trail, and she heard it before she saw it, iron on iron, steady and rhythmic, a sound that had its own particular authority. Real work. Work that does not stop because someone is coming. He didn't stop when she came through the door. He kept the hammer moving through 2 more strikes clean, unhurried, each one exactly placed, and then set it down and turned. She had seen his face from across the street. Up close it was more defined, weathered, and direct, with dark eyes that had the quality of someone who has spent a long time looking at things honestly and expects the same in return. He looked at her. Not at her situation, not at what she represented, not at the problem she was arriving with. At her, Mrs. Calloway. You know who I am, everybody knows who you are. You tore Hatch's paper in half and told two of Croft's hired men to leave your property. In a valley that's been quiet for 3 years, that's the only thing anyone's talking about. She almost smiled, almost. Then you know why I'm here. I know part of it. He picked up a rag and cleaned his hands with the systematic thoroughness of a man who has learned that attention to small things is what makes large things possible. You need someone who's not already in Croft's pocket, and not too afraid to say so. More than say it. He looked at her steadily. What do you have? Daniel's original deed and homestead filing. A northern boundary description that references a Granite Creek marker that Hatch claims doesn't exist in county records. It did exist. I've seen it, he said. 7 years ago. He set the rag aside and crossed to the stone wall at the back of the forge, and she heard the specific sound of something heavy being moved and then the sound that paper makes when it has been stored carefully for a long time and is being retrieved with care, the sound of something preserved. He came back with a flat oilskin bundle tied with leather cord. He set it on the workbench between them. I was a surveyor, he said. 14 years. I came through this valley 7 years ago on an independent survey job, before I left the profession and came back here for other reasons. His voice stayed level on that last phrase, not inviting the question behind it. I made copies of the county surveys as I went. Standard practice, a surveyor keeps his own record. I kept these because I'd been a surveyor long enough to know that original county documents are only as reliable as the people maintaining them, and I had enough experience with the ways people maintain things to think copies were worth keeping. She looked at the bundle on the workbench. Those show the creek marker. They show the creek marker, the granite stake reference, and the original lot line coordinates for every parcel in this valley at the time I surveyed, including yours. He watched her face. And I have spent the last 2 years watching what Croft's been doing to those coordinates in the current county records. The weight of what he was saying settled into her slowly and completely, the way understanding settles when it is very large and has to redistribute itself through the whole body before the mind can hold it. You've known, she said. You've had the original documentation and you've watched him alter the records. And you... She stopped herself. Not because she didn't have the rest of the sentence. She had it completely. She stopped because she looked at his face, at the specific quality of stillness there, the kind that belongs to a man who has been carrying a weight he knows the exact shape of. And she understood that whatever the reason was, it was not cowardice, and she did not know enough yet to judge it. Why, she asked instead, just that. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, because a blacksmith in a leased forge with no property claiming that the county land office is systematically committing fraud is a man they bury in paperwork and dismiss in 6 months. His voice was flat and measured. I needed someone with legal standing, a landowner who was actively being defrauded, someone they couldn't dismiss. He met her eyes. I needed someone who would fight. You were waiting. I was waiting. The forge coals breathed. Outside, the mountain was very quiet. Your family, she said carefully. You said you left the profession for other reasons. A long beat. My father had a farm, back east, 20 years ago. The words were flat the way words get when they've been handled so many times they've worn smooth. He built it from nothing. Lost it through a deed discrepancy, the same mechanism Croft uses here, just cruder. Different state, different men, same method. He looked at the bundle on the workbench. He died a year after they took it. I believe he died because he didn't have the will left to stay alive, and he didn't have the will because they had taken the thing he'd built his life around. The flatness in his voice had a single hairline crack in it, visible only because she was paying attention. I kept these surveys because I promised myself that if I ever saw it happening again and I had something that could stop it, I would not stand by and wait for someone with more to lose to act first. He paused. And then I stood by and waited. She looked at him for a long moment. You waited for someone who could win, she said. That's not the same thing. Something in his face shifted. Just slightly, Mrs. Calloway, a beat. Lily. He looked at the bundle, then back at her. If we use these, Croft will know where they came from. He has enough reach in this county to make my life significantly more difficult. I know. And whatever I have here, the legal standing to use it is yours, not mine. This goes nowhere without you in front of it. I know that too. Which means you're not just here for information. You're here to ask me to stand up with you. She looked at him directly. I'm here to ask you to stand up with me." He picked up the bundle, turned it once in his hands, set it back down on the workbench in front of her. "Take it," he said. "Read everything tonight. Come back tomorrow and tell me what you think we have." She put both hands on the bundle. "You kept this for 15 years," she said. "I kept it because my father deserved someone who acted when it mattered." He picked up his hammer. "Let's see if we can do better than that." She took the bundle. It was heavier than it looked, the weight of 7 years of careful preservation and 15 years of a promise. She turned toward the door and then stopped, because there was one more thing she needed to say, and she had learned in 38 years of living that the things you don't say at the right moment have a way of becoming the things you spend a long time wishing you'd said. Caleb Anderson. She turned back. "Whatever happens with this, however it goes what you did, keeping these, waiting for the right moment instead of giving up on the possibility of one that matters. I want you to know that I see it." He held her gaze. He didn't answer with words, but something in his face received what she'd said and held it carefully, the way he held the survey bundle, the way he held everything that had real weight. She went out into the afternoon. She came down the mountain trail with the bundle under her arm, and something in her chest that was not yet hope she couldn't afford. Hope. It was too fragile for what was coming, but was something more useful than hope. It was the feeling of solid ground under uncertain footing. It was the feeling of not being entirely alone in a fight that had, until an hour ago, felt like a matter of one woman and her fury against a system that had been running without interruption for 4 years. She was 300 yards from her fence line when she saw the rider at her gate. Not Hatch, younger, harder, with the settled professional patience of a man who does outdoor work that doesn't bear close examination. He had a bay horse and a rifle in the scabbard, and he was absolutely still, watching her come down the trail. He didn't speak until she reached the gate. "Then, Mrs. Calloway, Mr. Croft would appreciate a conversation. At your convenience." His eyes went to the bundle under her arm. Stayed there 1 second longer than they should have. She felt the second, counted it. "Tell Mr. Croft that when I have something to say to him, I'll say it somewhere public." She unlatched her own gate. "Good evening." She went inside, locked the door, sat down at the kitchen table and pulled the lamp close and untied the leather cord on the bundle with hands that were perfectly, deliberately steady. The first survey spread out under the lamplight. She could read a survey map. Daniel had taught her on this same table, years ago in this same light. Property lines, creek markers, coordinate notation. She had the knowledge, and she had Daniel's original homestead filing beside her, and she began to compare them, line by line, marker by marker, the way you do something important slowly, completely, without skipping anything. An hour in, she sat back. The Granite Creek marker was there, exactly where Daniel's filing said it was. Referenced in 3 separate notations in Caleb's survey copy, cross-referenced with elevation data and a neighboring property boundary, documented with the thoroughness of a professional who understood that good records are records that hold up when someone comes looking. And on the county's current deed description, the one Hatch had cited, the discrepancy, he claimed, was simply being addressed through legal process. The marker was gone. Not moved, not redescribed, gone as if it had never existed. The boundary line redrawn, without reference to any physical marker at all, floating in legal abstraction 300 feet north of where it had always actually been. She pulled the next survey from the bundle. The Henderson parcel. She didn't know the Hendersons well, but she knew the acreage, had seen it from her north fence line, the gentle slope down to the creek bend. She compared the original survey to what she knew of the current county description from Mrs. Teller's fragments. There it was again, a boundary moved, a water access point that had been on the Henderson land for 20 years, suddenly on the county-managed land that Croft had subsequently acquired. She pulled the next survey, the Marsh property. Same pattern, different boundary, same result. By the time she got to the 5th property, she had stopped being surprised and started being methodical, which was what the moment required. She was building an understanding of a system, and systems have logic. And once you understand the logic, you can predict the next step and the step after that. And you can position yourself in front of it instead of underneath it. She sat at her kitchen table until midnight. She read every survey in the bundle. By the time she folded the last one and retied the cord, she understood exactly what Silas Croft had built in Raven Hollow and exactly how he had built it, and exactly, with a precision that felt almost like calm, what it would take to bring it down. The lamp burned low. The valley outside her window was completely dark, the mountains invisible against the sky except where they blocked the stars. She thought about Caleb Anderson keeping 15 years of promise in an oilskin bundle behind his coal storage. She thought about what it cost a person to hold something that long without letting it become bitterness. She thought about her father-in-law, who had said on the day she married Daniel, "The land is the thing that stays when everything else moves." He had meant it as comfort. She understood it now as something more complicated. It was the land that stayed. Yes, but only if you stayed with it. Only if you fought for it with everything you had, and found people willing to stand beside you. She pressed both palms flat on the table. Tomorrow she would go back up the mountain. Tomorrow she and Caleb Anderson would begin the work of turning 15 years of careful documentation, something that Silas Croft could not buy, could not alter, could not make disappear. Tonight she sat in Daniel's kitchen, on Daniel's land, with the surveys spread before her like a map of everything that had been taken, and everything that could still be recovered, and she understood with total clarity that she had just become the most dangerous thing in Raven Hollow. Not because of what she had, because of what she was willing to do with it, and she was only just beginning. And what she was going to do with it. She was going to take it straight to every person in Raven Hollow who had lost something they couldn't prove, had been taken, and she was going to make Silas Croft explain himself in front of all of them, at once. That was the plan she had when she finally blew out the lamp and went to bed. By morning the plan had changed, because by morning someone had been inside her house. She knew it before she could name what she knew, the particular stillness of a space that has been disturbed, and then carefully arranged to look undisturbed. A chair not quite where she'd left it. The flour tin moved 2 inches to the right. Small things. The kind of small things that only matter if someone wants you to know they were there without being able to prove it. The survey bundle was exactly where she'd left it, under the loose floorboard beneath the kitchen table. That Daniel had built into the house in the first year, before he trusted the valley, before he trusted anyone. She hadn't told Caleb about the floorboard. She hadn't told anyone. It was hers and Daniel's. And whoever had come into her house in the night had not found it. But they had looked. She sat at the kitchen table with the bundle in her lap and understood very clearly that the time she had was shrinking. Croft's man had seen her come down from the mountain with something under her arm. Croft had sent someone in the night to find out what it was. They hadn't found it, but they knew it existed, and they would not wait long before the next move. She had maybe 2 days, possibly 3 if Croft was cautious by nature. She didn't think Silas Croft was cautious by nature. She thought he was patient, which was different. Patient men moved slowly until they were certain, and then they moved all at once. She needed to move first. She wrapped the bundle in oilcloth, tucked it inside her coat, and went out before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge. She went to Caleb Anderson. He was already at the forge when she arrived, which meant he had probably never stopped. There was something about men who lived alone and worked with their hands. The work became the rhythm of the day, and the rhythm of the day became the thing that held everything else in place. Without it, the edges came loose. He looked up when she came through the door and read her face in about 2 seconds flat. They came in the night. They didn't find it. But they know I have something. He set down the tongs he'd been holding. How much time do you think you have? 2 days. Maybe less. Then we have to move faster than I planned. He crossed to the workbench along the far wall and pulled a stool out from underneath. Sit down. I need to show you something I should have shown you yesterday. She sat. He reached behind the workbench and brought out a wooden box, plain and unmarked, the kind of box that looks like it holds tools because it is designed to look like it holds tools. Inside, beneath a layer of iron fittings and spare parts, was a second set of papers. Not surveys this time. Records, handwritten ledger entries, county assessor's office stamps, dates going back 4 years. She looked at him. Where did you get these? A man named Garrett Finch worked in the county records office until 8 months ago. He came to me because he'd seen what was being done to the Marsh family's deed, and he didn't know what to do about it. He was afraid. He had a wife and 2 daughters. Caleb's voice was level. He copied what he could before they let him go. They told him it was a budget reduction. He knew better. He gave me what he had and he left the valley. Why did he give them to you? Because I was the only person he trusted who had no connection to Croft's operation and no land for Croft to threaten. He spread the ledger pages on the workbench beside her. Look at the dates. Look at the property entries. She looked. The Henderson parcel altered 12 months before Hatch knocked on their door. The Marsh property altered 8 months before the forced sale. 2 other parcels she didn't recognize by name but could place by the survey coordinates, both altered in the same handwriting, the same ink, the same subtle shift in the boundary descriptions. And there, 18 months ago, quietly, without any porch visits yet, without any forged documents delivered, the northern boundary of the Callaway property. Her land. They had started on her land before Daniel was even close to dying. She put her finger on the entry. Her hand was perfectly steady. She was proud of that later, thinking back on it, that her hand was perfectly steady when she found out that they had already been coming for her, slow and patient and certain, for a year and a half while her husband was still alive. They planned this, she said. They planned everything. They knew about the lung sickness. They watched the valley lily. They watch who's struggling, who's sick. Who's going to leave a woman alone on 80 acres of mountain land? His jaw tightened. It's not a land office, it's a system. The fury that moved through her was clean and cold and very useful. Garrett Finch, she said. Would he testify? He's in Billings. He was scared enough to leave the valley entirely. But would he testify if there was a case solid enough that he wasn't walking into it alone? Caleb was quiet for a moment. I think so. If the case was real and the protection was real, then we need to build something real. She pulled the oilcloth bundle from inside her coat and laid it beside the ledger pages. Your surveys. Together, what do we have? He looked at both sets of documents for a long moment, the way a man looks at something when he's doing serious math in his head and doesn't want to speak until he's certain. Together, he said slowly, we have a documented pattern of systematic deed fraud across at least 6 properties over 4 years. We have original survey records that contradict the current county documentation. We have internal ledger entries that show the alterations were deliberate and coordinated. He paused. We have enough to bring a federal land fraud case. Federal, state courts here are compromised. Croft's been buying influence for years. But federal jurisdiction over land fraud is different. The railroad land grants brought federal oversight into the territory. There's a federal land commissioner in Helena. Lily felt something shift in the room, not dramatically, not with any announcement, just a quiet repositioning of what was possible. How do we get to Helena? We don't go to Helena. We get word to Helena. There's a federal circuit inspector who covers this district, a man named Aldous Webb. He came through the valley 2 years ago on routine survey work. I spoke with him briefly. Caleb pulled the wooden box fully onto the workbench. If we can get documentation to Webb, he has the authority to open a formal investigation. That investigation operates outside Croft's reach. And inside that investigation, Croft can't quietly make documents disappear. Not without making himself the subject of something much worse than a land dispute. She looked at him straight. You've been thinking about this for a long time. I've been waiting for someone withstanding to fight it. Something in his face shifted, not softened exactly, but opened slightly, the way a man's face opens when he says something true that he's been carrying a long time. I had the evidence. I didn't have the standing. A mountain blacksmith with no property claiming that the county land office is systematically committing fraud is a man they can dismiss. A landowner with documented legal standing whose property is actively being seized, that's a complainant. You needed me. I needed someone like you. Someone they couldn't dismiss. He held her gaze. I'm sorry it took what it took to bring you here. The apology was real. Don't be sorry, she said. Be ready. Because we need to get this documentation to Webb before Croft figures out what we have, and I think we have about 48 hours before this goes from a property dispute to something more dangerous. I know. He began organizing the documents, the surveys, the ledger copies with the systematic care of a man who has handled important papers before and understands that how they're organized matters as much as what they contain. I need to write to Webb tonight. The circuit mail goes through Raven Hollow on Thursdays. That's 2 days from now. If we can get a letter in the pouch before Croft's man at the post office sees what it is. Croft has a man at the post office. He has eyes everywhere. But the circuit mail is federal property. Interfering with it is a federal crime. Even Croft's people are careful about that. So we write the letter. We put it in the federal mail. And then we wait. And then we wait. and we make sure nothing happens to the originals in the meantime. She thought about the loose floorboard. I need somewhere safer than my house. Here, he said immediately, not as an offer, as a fact. Nobody searches the forge. It's leased property, not mine. There's no deed connection to your case that would give Croft legal justification for a search. And the stone walls are 2 feet thick. She looked around the forge, the iron tools, the coals, the ordered weight of a workspace built for serious work. All right, she said. Here. They spent the next 4 hours at the workbench. Caleb wrote with the careful precision of a man who had once written official survey reports, clear language, specific dates, property coordinates, document reference numbers. Lily read each section as he finished it, and pushed back twice where she thought he was being too restrained. You're writing like a man who's afraid they won't take you seriously, she said the second time. He looked at what he'd written. I'm writing like a man who knows that federal inspectors respond to evidence, not emotion. You can have both. She took the pen he let her take it without argument, which told her something, and rewrote the paragraph in question. Evidence front, the stakes of inaction second, the human cost third, all of it in plain language that left nothing ambiguous. He read it. Better, he said. Daniel always said I was a better writer than he was. He meant it as a compliment. He was right. She handed the pen back. They continued. When the letter was finished and the documentation list complete, she copied it in her own hand as a second set, 2 identical packages, because they had decided that sending only one to Webb was too much of a risk. The second set would go to the nearest territorial newspaper, the Billings Gazette, addressed to the editor personally, marked as a public interest matter. If both disappear, Lily said, then someone has interfered with federal mail and suppressed Tepper's inquiry simultaneously. That's not a county land dispute anymore. That's a story that writes itself, Caleb said. Exactly. They worked until the light changed and the forge coals had burned down twice and been fed again. At some point, Caleb put coffee on strong and black, the kind of coffee that says, this is a workspace, and we are working. And Lily drank 2 cups without tasting either one, because she was reading and thinking, and her mind was entirely elsewhere. It was only when they finished, when the documents were wrapped and sealed, and the letter was folded inside its envelope, with the federal address written clearly on the outside, that she sat back on the stool and felt the full weight of the last 12 days come down on her all at once. She didn't cry. She wouldn't. But she put her elbows on the workbench and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a moment, just a moment, and breathed. Caleb didn't say anything. He didn't offer comfort or tell her it was going to be fine. He just put a fresh cup of coffee beside her hand and went back to the other side of the workbench and let her have the moment without making it into something she had to perform her way out of. That was the exact right thing to do. She lowered her hands, picked up the coffee. Thank you, she said, not just for the coffee. He nodded, not just in response to the coffee. She left the forge as the sun began its descent behind the western ridge, the sealed packages wrapped inside her coat again. Her mind already working through the Thursday logistics. She had one stop to make before she went home. Frank Aldro's place was a mile south, a smaller operation than hers, a man with a wife and 3 children and the perpetual expression of someone doing careful arithmetic about risk. She had told him she wouldn't ask him to take sides. She was keeping that promise. She wasn't going to ask him to take sides. She was going to ask him to do something much smaller. She found him mending fence along his east pasture, which was either coincidence or the kind of work a man does when he needs to be outside and moving and slightly removed from his own thoughts. Lily. He stopped working but kept the fence tool in his hand. The arithmetic happened on his face visible, almost like watching a man add a column of numbers and not like the sum. I'm not asking you to get involved, she said. I need you to know one thing. On Thursday, when the circuit mail comes through, there's going to be a federal inspector's letter in the pouch. If that letter doesn't reach Helena if someone stops it, or it disappears, I need you to be able to say, under oath if it comes to that I told you it existed, and that I told you where it was going. He stared at her. You're building a record, he said slowly, so that if they interfere with it, there's a witness to the interference. I'm protecting the mail, protecting you too. In a way, if the worst happens and this goes badly for me, I don't want you caught in the middle of something you didn't know about. This way you know. This way if someone asks you later, you can tell the truth, which is that Lily Calloway told you she was filing a federal complaint, and you heard her say it. Frank Aldro looked at the fence tool in his hand. At the east pasture. At the middle distance, where his careful arithmetic lived. The Hendersons, he said. Did they know about the document fraud? No, they were working blind. His jaw moved once. All right, he said. I know about the letter. She nodded once, turned, and started the walk back to her own fence line. Thursday arrived with the particular quality of a day that has decided to mean something. The circuit mail rider came through Raven Hollow. At 10 in the morning, a young man named Pace, who rode the same route every 2 weeks and had the brisk professional manner of someone who takes federal property very seriously, which was exactly why Caleb had suggested using this particular mechanism. Lily was at the post office when Pace arrived. Not waiting, obviously. Not standing at the counter, she was across the street at the general store. Visible through the window, watching. Caleb was not visible. That was intentional. 2 people at the post office might draw attention. 1 person at the store across the street was just a woman, buying supplies on a Thursday morning. The man Croft had placed in the post office was a thin, watchful individual named Pryor, who sorted mail with the systematic attention of someone who has been told to pay attention and takes pride in paying it well. Lily had identified him 2 days ago by the simple method of noticing which postal employee seemed most interested in who was sending and receiving what. Pace came in. The federal mail pouch went on the counter. The exchange was routine. Lily watched Pryor watch the pouch. She watched him examine the outgoing letters that Pace had collected from the local drop box. She watched him pause. He was holding her letter to Webb. He read the address, read it again. Then he looked up and appeared to consider something. And Lily's pulse spiked hard, and she made herself stand very still with her hand on a jar of preserves on the general store shelf and look like a woman who was thinking about whether she needed preserves. Then Pryor put the letter back in the federal pouch. The pause had lasted maybe 4 seconds. But 4 seconds was long enough to be significant. She didn't know what he'd decided or what he'd been instructed to do if this exact situation arose. She only knew that the letter had gone back into the federal pouch, and Pace had collected the pouch, and Pace had walked back out to his horse and ridden east. She bought the preserves. She walked back to her house. She sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the wood and told herself that the letter was on its way, and now she had to wait, and waiting was the hardest part of any fight. Because your mind fills the silence with everything that could go wrong. She was still sitting there when someone knocked on her door. Not the front door, the back. She crossed to it carefully. Opened it. It was the young woman from the church, 16, 17 at most, with the quick, cautious eyes of someone who has grown up knowing when to be invisible. Her name was Clara, Pastor Henning's niece, who helped with the church cleaning on Thursdays. Mrs. Calloway. Clara looked over her shoulder before she spoke. Mr. Pryor went to the telegraph office. Lily went still. How long ago? Right after the mail rider left. Maybe 20 minutes. 20 minutes. A telegraph could reach Croft in less than an hour. And Croft, if he was told about the letter, would not wait for it to reach Helena before he acted. He would act now on the ground, against whatever he could still reach. Against the originals. Against Caleb. Lily was already moving before she finished the thought. She went up the mountain trail at a pace that would have alarmed anyone watching, which is why she left by the east side of her property, and came at the trail from the tree line rather than the road. She had no way of knowing how fast Croft would move or what he'd sent, but a man with Croft's resources and a 2-hour head start on a federal complaint wasn't going to wait around making careful decisions. The forge was quiet when she arrived. Too quiet, she pushed the door open. Caleb was at the far end of the shop, and he was not alone. 2 men stood between her and him. She recognized neither of them, not hired locals, but brought-in men, the kind who travel with their work. One was holding something, not a paper, Mrs. Calloway. The man with the paper had a flat Midwestern voice and the patient expression of someone following precise instructions. We represent Mr. Croft's legal interests. We have a warrant issued this morning by County Judge Farrell authorizing the search and seizure of any fraudulent documents related to an ongoing property dispute. We have reason to believe those documents are on these premises. Judge Farrell, she said, Croft's judge, a duly appointed county magistrate. She looked at Caleb. His face was carefully neutral. He gave her nothing, and she understood why if she reacted to his expression, they'd know what they were looking for. So she read him by what wasn't in his face, by the absolute absence of alarm, and understood. The documents weren't there. Sometime in the last 2 hours before Pryor had gone to the telegraph office. Before any of this had started moving, Caleb had moved them. "Search what you like," she said. "You won't find what you're looking for here." The man with the paper looked at her steadily. "Where are they?" "I have no idea what documents you're referring to." "Mrs. Calloway, I came up here to ask Mr. Ernst about a repair to my fence gate. If you've finished with your legal theater, I'd like to have that conversation." The two men exchanged a look. They searched the forge systematically, thoroughly, the way men search when they've been told exactly what they're looking for, and given enough time to look properly. They went through the workbench, the storage boxes, the coal area, the stone alcoves in the wall. They found tools, iron stock, a spare saddle from some previous tenant, coffee grounds, nothing else. When they finally left, they left without a word, which was somehow worse than anger. Anger meant surprise. Silence meant they were adjusting, and they would be back with a different approach. Lily waited until the sound of their horses was gone. "Where are they?" Caleb looked at her. Then, for the first time since she'd met him, something that might have been humor moved at the corner of his mouth. "Mrs. Teller's flour storage." Lily stared at him. "She came up this morning," he said. "She heard about the letter. She said she was tired of being afraid, and she had a flour barrel in the back of her storeroom that nobody had looked inside in 15 years, and she wanted to be useful." He paused. "She also said to tell you that she put the preserves on sale today, so you'd have a reason to be in the store if you needed to be." Lily stood in the middle of the emptied forge and felt something happen in her chest that was too complicated to name cleanly, something that was gratitude and grief, and the particular kind of relief that comes from discovering that you are not, in fact, alone. "Mrs. Teller," she said. "Turns out the Hendersons were her cousins," Caleb said quietly. She never said so publicly. But she'd been waiting for someone to do something for 3 years. The forge coals ticked. "How many people are waiting," Lily said, "who just didn't think there was anything solid enough to stand behind? That's the question, isn't it?" "It's the answer." She looked at him directly. "We need to stop acting like we're two people fighting this alone. We need to start acting like what we actually are, which is the people who finally have documentation solid enough to gather behind." Caleb was quiet for a moment. A public meeting, a real one. Not church socials and whispered conversations. A real meeting with the documents present where every family in this valley who has lost something or is afraid of losing something can see with their own eyes what Croft has done. If Croft hears about a public meeting before it happens, he will hear about it. That's not the problem. The problem would be if he hears about it and can stop it before it happens. So we don't plan it, we do it. She looked at the forge door, at the trail beyond it, at the valley below. "Tomorrow night, the church. Pastor Henning said he'd do whatever was needed." "You already asked Henning." "I asked him 2 days ago. I was hoping I wouldn't need it. I need it." For a long moment, Caleb Anderson stood very still in the middle of his forge, and she could see something working through him, not reluctance, something older than reluctance. The last resistance of a man who has protected himself against loss for 15 years. And is being asked to step back out into open country. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow night, tomorrow night." She moved toward the door, then stopped, turned back. "They're going to hear about this before morning, and they're going to come at you tonight. Not with a warrant this time. You need to not be here tonight." He looked around the forge, at the tools, the coals, the place he had built his life inside. "I'm not running from my own forge. I'm not asking you to run. I'm asking you to sleep somewhere else for one night." "Where?" "Henning's. He already knows everything, which makes him the worst possible witness if Croft tries anything, because a pastor's testimony is very difficult to discredit." She met his eyes. "Please." The please moved something in him. She saw it. "One night," he said. "One night." She walked down the mountain trail in the late afternoon, and behind her the forge went quiet as the coals settled, and somewhere below in the valley a telegraph wire was humming, with a message that was moving faster than she could walk. And Silas Croft was reading it, and whatever he was going to do next was already in motion. She thought about her husband, about the kitchen table and the lamp and the map-reading lessons that had seemed, at the time, like just another winter evening. She thought about Mrs. Teller with the flour barrel, about Frank Aldro and his fence and his careful arithmetic finally adding up to yes, about Garrett Finch in Billings, still carrying copies of records he'd been afraid to use, about Caleb Anderson keeping surveys for 15 years because his father had lost a farm and no one had stood up at the right moment with the right proof. She was not alone. She had never, it turned out, been entirely alone. She had just been waiting for the moment, when all the people who were waiting for the same reason finally found each other. Tomorrow night in Pastor Henning's church, they would find each other. And Silas Croft would have to decide what kind of man he was willing to show the entire valley he was. Lily Calloway came through her front gate, went inside, and locked the door. She had one more night to get through. She had survived worse. She had survived worse, and she meant to survive this too. But surviving and winning were two different things, and by the time the sun came up on Friday morning, Lily Calloway understood that the next 24 hours would determine which one she got. She had not slept much. That was fine. She had sat at the kitchen table with Daniel's old map of the valley spread out in front of her, not because she needed the map, but because having something to look at gave her mind somewhere to put itself while it worked through every angle of what was coming. By the time the light came through the east window, she had run the possibilities down to the ones that mattered. And what mattered was this: the meeting had to happen before Croft moved, and Croft was going to move today. She was sure of it the moment she stepped outside and saw the rider at the end of her road. Not the same man as before. Different horse, different build, but the same quality of stillness, the same professional patience of someone who has been placed somewhere and told to stay and report. Croft had upgraded from monitoring to surveillance, which meant he knew the letter had gone, and he was trying to understand what else was in motion before he committed to his next action. She did not look at the rider for more than a second. She went to her barn, saw to her animals with the methodical attention of a woman who has learned that routine is its own form of armor, and came back inside through the kitchen door. Then she went out the window on the north side, dropped into the tall grass behind the woodpile, and moved along the fence line in the direction of town. Pastor Henning was in the church when she arrived, which was not surprising, since Pastor Henning was almost always in the church. He was a small man who had been old for as long as anyone in Raven Hollow could remember, with the permanent slight stoop of someone who has spent decades bending over things that need attention, and he greeted Lily with the calm of a man who has made peace with the fact that God's work is frequently inconvenient. "Tonight," she said, before he could offer coffee or condolences or anything else, "we need to move it to tonight early. 6 o'clock if you can get word to people." "I can get word." He folded his hands. "How much trouble are we expecting?" "Enough that I'd feel better if everyone was inside before dark." He absorbed this without visible alarm. That was one of the things Lily appreciated about Henning. He did not perform surprise at things that should not be surprising. "I'll send Clara," he said. "She knows who needs to know. Tell her to go on foot and to go separately to each house. No gathering in the street. No visible preparation. Lily," he looked at her steadily, "are you all right?" "I'm angry," she said, which is better than afraid. "In my experience, they're not mutually exclusive." "No," she agreed, "they're not." She left and went to Mrs. Teller's store, because the flour barrel in Mrs. Teller's storeroom was the most important thing in Raven Hollow this morning, and she needed to know it was still there. Mrs. Teller was behind her counter when Lily came in, and she did not react beyond a brief tightening of her expression that communicated everything necessary. "Back storeroom," she said quietly. "Still there. Pryor came in an hour ago and bought tobacco and spent about 10 minutes looking at things he had no intention of buying." "Did he go into the back?" "He tried. I told him the storeroom was private storage and offered to find whatever he needed from the front shelves." A pause. "He left. He'll be back." With more authority than he had this morning. "Then we should move it." Lily thought for exactly 3 seconds. "The church, tonight at 6. Henning will have people there." Mrs. Teller absorbed this. She was a practical woman who had spent 20 years running a store in a difficult town, and who understood logistics the way a person understands something they have depended on for survival. "I'll bring the barrel myself. 4 o'clock. Through the alley." "Thank you. Don't thank me." Mrs. Teller's voice was quiet and very firm. "The Hendersons were my family. I have been thanking myself for not acting sooner for 3 years. I would like to stop thanking myself for that." Lily left the store. Outside, the town moved around her with its ordinary morning pace, the feed barn busy, the harness shop quiet, 2 men talking in front of the saloon with the unfocused ease of men who don't have anywhere urgent to be. Normal. Surface normal. The kind of normal that a town puts on when it is waiting for something and doesn't want to look like it's waiting. She needed Caleb. He was at Henning's house. as agreed, and when she came to the side door and knocked twice, he opened it immediately, which told her he'd been awake and listening for exactly that knock. He had the careful, composed look of a man who has had a long night in a strange place and is managing it through sheer discipline. "They came to the forge last night," he said before she could speak. She went still. "How do you know?" Henning's niece Clara saw the lights. "Two men, around midnight. They spent an hour inside." He stepped back from the door. "Come in." She came in. The small sitting room smelled like old books and lamp oil, and Henning was nowhere visible, giving them privacy with the tact of a man who understands when to be somewhere else. "Did they find anything?" "There's nothing to find. I made sure of that before I left." He was quiet for a moment. "But they left something." She looked at him. A message, written on the workbench in chalk. He held her gaze. It said, "Some fights are not worth the cost. Consider who pays it." The room was very quiet. "They're threatening you," she said. "They're threatening anyone standing near me." His voice was level, but she could hear what was underneath it, not fear. Something more controlled than fear. The specific tension of a man who has been threatened before and knows exactly what it means and what it doesn't mean. "They want me to tell you it's not worth it, is it?" He looked at her directly. "I kept those surveys for 15 years, he said. "I kept them because I believed the moment would come. I'm not walking away from it because someone wrote in chalk on my workbench in the dark." "Good," she sat down, "because tonight is happening. 6 o'clock. The church. I need you there with the documentation, and I need you to be able to stand up and explain what those surveys show in plain language that every farmer and shopkeeper in that room can follow. I can do that. They will try to stop it. I don't know how yet. But between now and 6 o'clock, we need to assume that Croft knows about the meeting and is deciding what to do about it." Caleb sat down across from her. "Then we need to think about what he can do. He can send men to the church. He can. But a room full of Valley families is a different problem than a widow alone on her property. There's a witness calculus that even Croft has to respect. He can try to discredit the documents before the meeting. Tell people they're forgeries. He can claim it. He can't prove it without access to the originals, and his own men just searched the forge and came up empty. He doesn't know where the originals are. He can go after you directly." She said it plainly because it needed saying plainly. "Not legally the other way." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "He can try," he said finally. "I'm not easy to move." That was all he said about it. She accepted it at that. "There's one more thing," she said. "When we get everyone in that room tonight, it can't just be a presentation of evidence. It has to be a decision. These families have to decide together, in that room, whether they're willing to put their names behind a formal complaint to the federal inspector. If they don't, if I stand up there with documentation, and nobody will sign their name to it, then Croft wins anyway. They'll sign. You don't know that." "No." He looked at his hands, the blacksmith's hands, scarred and capable and very still. "But I know that people who have been afraid for a long time and waiting for a reason to stop being afraid will do more than you expect when the reason finally arrives. They just need to see that someone else went first." "I went first." "You went first," he agreed. "That matters more than you think." She stood. 6 o'clock. Don't come to the church directly. Come from the North Trail, past the Miller property. Clara will leave the side door unlocked." "All right. And Caleb." She stopped at the door. "If something happens between now and 6, if they get to you, if they try to take you somewhere or hold you on some invented charge, you do not have the documentation on you. Make sure that's true." "It's already true." She nodded once. Went out into the morning. The hours between noon and 6 were the longest of Lily Calloway's adult life, and she had had some long ones. She spent them at her house openly, visible, making herself available to be seen by Croft's watchers so that no one went looking for her elsewhere. She chopped wood. She mended fence. She did every routine visible task she could think of with the deliberate calm of a woman who has nothing unusual planned for this evening. At 2 o'clock, Sheriff Dunbar rode up to her fence line. She set down the axe and waited for him to speak. "I've been told there's a meeting planned at the church tonight," he said. He was looking at a point, somewhere past her left shoulder, which was a habit she'd noticed. Dunbar rarely looked directly at things that made him uncomfortable. "I'd ask you to reconsider." "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that a public gathering of this kind, given the current tensions, could create a situation that—" "Sheriff," she kept her voice even. "The church is a public building where free citizens of this territory have the right to assemble. Pastor Henning has offered it for a community meeting. There is nothing in the law of Montana Territory that requires me to seek your approval. I'm asking as a courtesy, and I'm declining as a courtesy. She picked the axe back up. If you're concerned about public order tonight, I'd suggest you be present at the meeting. That way you can see for yourself that it's entirely peaceful. Dunbar's jaw worked. He looked at his horse's ears. Croft is not a patient man when he feels he's being publicly challenged. I know exactly what Croft is, she said, do you? He rode away without answering. She went back to chopping wood, and she did not let herself watch him go. At 4 o'clock she changed her coat and walked to the church through the back pasture. The side door was unlocked as promised. Inside she found Mrs. Teller and Clara already there. A flour barrel sitting open in the corner, the oilcloth bundles spread on the long table that Henning used for Sunday fellowship suppers. Mrs. Teller looked all here, all intact, good. Lily pulled up a chair. Let's organize what we're showing and in what order. By 5:30 people were arriving, not in a crowd in ones and twos, spread across a 20-minute window, coming from different directions with the careful nonchalance of people who have been told to act casual and are trying very hard to act casual, which is itself a kind of obviousness, but an honest one. Lily stood near the door and watched them come in. She knew some faces and not others. Frank Aldro came alone, without his wife, which told her he'd made a decision he didn't want to involve her in yet. A man she didn't recognize, weathered, 60s, with the permanent squint of high-altitude work, came in and nodded at her, with the specific nod of someone who has heard enough to know why they're here. 17 people in the first 20 minutes, then 22. At 5 minutes to 6, the door opened and Caleb Anderson came in from the north side entrance, and the quality of attention in the room shifted slightly, not dramatic. Just the subtle reorganization that happens when a room recognizes that the person who just walked in is going to matter to what happens next. He came to stand beside Lily. How many? He said quietly. 26. I expected 15 travels. Word has been waiting to travel for 3 years. She looked at the room, at the faces. Some afraid, some angry, some wearing the particular expression of people who have already decided and are simply waiting for the moment to make it official. She thought about what Caleb had said, people who have been waiting for a reason to stop being afraid. She stepped to the front of the room. Thank you for coming. Her voice carried without effort. She had learned early that a room full of people pays attention to a voice that doesn't ask for attention. I'm not going to take a long time with preamble. You're here because you've heard something, or you've seen something, or you've had something happen to your family that you couldn't explain and couldn't fight. I'm here because I have an explanation, and I have something to fight with. She nodded to Caleb. He spread the surveys on the table. These are original county survey documents, she said. Copies made before the records office was compromised. They show the actual property boundaries of 8 parcels in this valley, as they existed before Silas Croft began systematically altering the county deed records. The room was very quiet. I'm going to show you your land, she said, the way it looked before someone changed the paperwork. And then I'm going to show you what it looks like in the current county records. And then I need you to tell me if what I'm showing you is familiar. She picked up the first survey, the Henderson parcel. A woman in the 3rd row made a sound, not a word, just a breath that had something in it. Lily kept her eyes on the document. The original northern boundary follows the creek to the standing granite marker, registered in 1871. In the current county records, that granite marker does not appear. The boundary is described differently, shortening the parcel by approximately 22 acres. She set the survey down. Is that your family? The woman nodded. She was gripping the hand of the man beside her. Was that land accessed by the creek? Our water rights, Martha Henderson said. Her voice was thin and tight. We lost our water rights. You didn't lose them, Lily said. They were taken. Through a document that was altered after the fact in the county records office. She looked at the room. That is what happened to your family. It is what they tried to do to mine. The room had been quiet before. Now it was a different kind of quiet, the kind that comes not from shock but from recognition. From 29 people putting a word to something they had experienced and not been able to name. That word was fraud, and the word once spoken changed everything. Caleb spent the next 40 minutes walking through the surveys with the systematic patience of a man who has explained technical information to non-technical people before and understands that what matters is not the detail, But the pattern. He did not overwhelm them with coordinates and reference numbers. He showed them the before and the after, property by property, and he let the pattern speak for itself. The pattern was damning. Every alteration moved a boundary. Every moved boundary either reduced the landowner's acreage, eliminated a water access point, or removed a mineral claim marker. Every single one of those changes benefited either Croft directly or a third party who had subsequently sold the resulting parcel to Croft. 7 of the 8 properties in the documents had ended up in whole or in part in Croft's name or under his control. The 8th was Lily's. When Caleb finished, spoke for a full 10 seconds. Then Frank Aldro said quietly, "That's my neighbor's land. The Petersons. They left 2 years ago. Said they had a deed problem they couldn't afford to fight. The Peterson parcel is in here," Caleb said. The alteration was made 14 months before they left. Aldro stared at the survey. His arithmetic face had changed into something harder and more definite. "What do we do?" It came from the back of the room, the weathered man Lily hadn't recognized. She found out later his name was Dune, and he'd been a miner before he'd tried to homestead, and he'd watched 2 friends lose their claims before he'd sold his own rather than fight what he couldn't see. "We file a formal complaint with the federal land inspector," Lily said. "His name is Aldous Webb, and he has jurisdiction over territorial land fraud. We send him the documentation, the original surveys, the internal records copies, everything we have with as many names attached as are willing to put their names to it. A single complaint from a widow is a dispute. 27 complaints from 27 Valley families is an investigation. And if Croft comes after the people who sign." Martha Henderson's voice was still thin, but there was something different in it now. The Hendersons had nothing he could threaten anymore. "Other people here have more to lose." "That's true," Lily said. "I won't pretend otherwise. Signing your name to this carries risk." She looked around the room. "But I want you to think about what you've already lost. And I want you to think about what you'll continue to lose if this keeps going. Because Croft is not finished. He has not reached the edge of his ambition. If he gets my land, and he will get it, unless we stop him, the next parcel he goes after belongs to someone else in this room. And the one after that, and the one after that." She paused. "This does not stop until someone stops it. I am trying to stop it." The room breathed. Then Martha Henderson stood up. "Where do I sign?" 2 seconds. 5 seconds. The man beside her stood up. Frank Aldro stood up. Dune from the back stood up, and the sound of chairs moving was its own kind of statement. Lily had brought paper. She'd brought it because she had decided to believe that it would be needed. She spread it on the table. 21 people signed. 21 names, not all 27, because 5 were too frightened, and 1 man left without explaining himself. But 21 names on a formal complaint to the federal land inspector, with the survey documentation attached, written in Lily's clear hand and countersigned by Pastor Henning as witness. It was the most significant document in the history of Raven Hollow, and it looked like a piece of paper with ink on it, which was exactly the right way for something that important to look. Caleb began making copies. He worked fast. The systematic speed of a man with a surveyor's training who understands that redundancy is not paranoia but professionalism. 2 copies. 3. Each going to a different location with a different trusted person before the night was over. Lily was folding the original when the church door opened. Not the side door, the front. Gerald Hatch walked in. He was not alone. Behind him came the 2 flat-faced men she recognized from the forge, and behind them came a man she had not seen before, older, heavier, with the settled proprietary calm of a man who moves through spaces as if he owns them because he usually does. Silas Croft. She had wondered what he looked like. She had built a picture in her mind from what she'd been told and what she'd observed at a distance. And the reality was both more and less than the picture. More ordinary, he was a man of 60 or so, with gray at his temples and a good coat, and the soft hands of someone who had not done physical labor in many years. Less containable because ordinariness in a man who does extraordinary damage is not reassurance, it is its own kind of warning. He looked at the room, at the table, at the documents spread across it. His face showed nothing. That was the most frightening thing. "Mrs. Calloway." His voice was moderate, reasonable, the voice of a man who has learned that reasonable tones are more effective than angry ones in rooms full of witnesses. "I'd like to have a word." "You're having one," she said, "in front of 21 people who have just signed a federal complaint against you. Say whatever you'd like." Something moved behind his eyes. The reasonable tone stayed in place over it. "What you have there." he said, gesturing at the table, are documents of questionable provenance. The county has reason to believe they've been altered or fabricated to support a fraudulent complaint. Filing false statements with a federal inspector is a serious matter. It is, Lily agreed, which is why every document on that table is an original or a verified copy, and why the person who produced them is a licensed surveyor of 14 years' experience who will swear to their authenticity in front of any court in this territory. A blacksmith's word, Hatch said from behind Croft. The dismissal was practiced. A federal inspector's analysis, Caleb said, stepping forward. His voice was level and unhurried. The letter reached Helena 2 days ago. Webb will be here within the week. He can examine the originals and the county records simultaneously and determine for himself which one shows evidence of alteration. I'm looking forward to that examination. Croft's reasonable expression did not change, but Hatch had gone pale. The room had gone completely still, that particular stillness of people who are watching something important happen and do not want to miss a word of it. You're making a serious mistake, Croft said. Not to Lily. To the room. All of you. I have invested considerably in this valley. The development I've planned will bring jobs, infrastructure, economic growth. The people who choose to align themselves against that. You stole from us. Martha Henderson's voice came from the middle of the room, clear and certain, no tremor in it. You stole my family's water rights through a forged deed line, and we lost our farm because of it. And my husband worked that land for 12 years, and I have watched my children wonder why we couldn't keep what their father built. She stood up. Don't talk to me about economic growth. Croft looked at her. Then at the room, Lily thought. Calculating. The eyes of a man doing the same arithmetic he always did, measuring what he could still control. This will be contested, he said, quietly, almost politely. Contest it, Lily said. Contest it in federal court, with a federal inspector who has been sent the original documentation, with 21 signed complainants, with a newspaper in Billings that will receive its copy of this complaint by Monday's mail. She looked at him steadily. Contest it in public, Mr. Croft. I will look forward to the venue. Croft looked at her for a long moment. He had the eyes of a man who is reclassifying a problem, moving it from one category to another, from something he expected to something he had not. She could see him doing it. Most people, when they were reclassified by a man like Croft, felt the weight of that attention as something threatening. Lily felt it as confirmation. If she had been easy, he would not have come himself. Good evening, he said. He turned and walked out. Hatch followed. The 2 hired men followed, and the door swung shut behind them, and for 3 full seconds nobody in the room said anything. Then Frank Aldro exhaled. Then someone laughed, short and shaky, the laugh of a person releasing pressure they didn't know they'd been holding. Then the room came back to life. It took another hour to distribute the document copies, assign trusted holders for each one, and make sure every person who had signed understood what to expect in the coming days. Lily talked until her throat was dry. Caleb answered technical questions about survey procedure with the patient precision that was apparently his natural mode of operation. When it was finally done and the last person had left, and Henning had quietly locked the front door, Lily sat down on a church pew and let herself be still for the first time in what felt like weeks. Caleb sat down at the other end of the pew. Neither of them spoke for a moment. He'll try something before Webb gets here, she said. Yes, I don't know what. He's had time to think now. It won't be the same approaches. No, Caleb was quiet for a moment. When a man like Croft decides to stop being reasonable, he usually goes after whatever matters most. Not the evidence he's understood, he can't get to that now. What he goes after is the people. She turned to look at him. Who matters most to this case? You and whoever's most visibly standing beside you. The implication was clear, and neither of them looked away from it. I'm not asking you to step back, she said. I wouldn't ask that. He looked at his hands. I'm not stepping back, a beat. But I am asking you to be careful. Not the kind of careful that means quiet. The kind of careful that means paying attention. I've been paying attention since the moment they showed up on my porch. I know you have. He turned to look at her directly, and she saw something in his face that had not been there in the forge on the first day. Something that had been building through the surveys and the coffee and the hours at the workbench, and all the careful, purposeful work of the last week. You have been the most consistently attentioned person I have ever met. It was not a declaration. It was not that kind of moment. But it was real, and she received it as real. We're not done, she said. No, whatever he does next, we have to be ready for it. We will be. She looked at the front of the church, at the plain wooden cross that Henning kept polished, at the ordinary honest simplicity of a place built for the difficult business of holding people together when things fell apart. 21 names on a piece of paper. A federal inspector riding toward Raven Hollow. Documents in 6 different locations with 6 different people, each one a piece of what Silas Croft had done and could no longer undo. She was not finished. She was nowhere near finished. But she had changed the shape of the fight, and Croft knew it, and every person in this valley who had signed their name tonight knew it too. She stood up. "Go back to the forge tonight," she said to Caleb. "Go home. Don't give him the satisfaction of keeping you out of your own place." He stood. "I'm going home too." She looked at him. "My home, my land, the land they are not going to take." She walked out of the church into the night air of Raven Hollow, cool and clean, and very still, and somewhere above the valley the mountains held their permanent watch, and she walked home through the dark without a lamp because she knew the road. Yes, she had always known the road, and she was not afraid of it. She was afraid of what was coming. But fear and courage were not, as Henning had said, mutually exclusive. She had proved that much at least. What remained to be proved was whether the courage would be enough for what Silas Croft had not yet shown his hand on, and as she pushed open her front door and went inside and locked it behind her, she understood with absolute clarity that the worst of this story had not happened yet. It was still coming, and she intended to be standing when it arrived. It was still coming, and it arrived before dawn. She heard the horses first, not one, not two, but several, moving with the coordinated purpose of men who have been given an assignment and a time, and are executing both without hesitation. She was already out of bed by the time the sound resolved into direction, and the direction was not her fence line, but the road beyond it, moving north, moving toward the mountain trail, moving toward the forge. She understood in the space between one heartbeat and the next. They weren't coming for her. They were going for Caleb. She dressed in 30 seconds. Boots, coat, the small knife she had kept in her bedside table since the night someone had searched her house. She was out the back window before she'd finished deciding to go, moving through the dark along the fence line. It was as fast as she could manage without making noise she couldn't afford. The mountain trail was a 20-minute walk in daylight. She covered it in 12. She smelled the smoke before she cleared the tree line. Not forge smoke. Not the controlled working smell of coal and iron that she had come to associate with Caleb's workplace and Caleb's presence. This was different, bigger. The particular smell of wood catching and spreading, of something being destroyed that was not meant to burn. She ran the last 300 yards. The forge itself was stone and would not burn, but the attached wooden lean to where Caleb stored finished work and kept his horse was fully alight, and the heat of it pushed against her face like a physical thing when she came through the tree line. 2 horses stood at the far edge of the clearing, riderless, which meant the riders were still here somewhere, and she stopped at the edge of the firelight and looked and found them almost immediately. 3 men, one of them had Caleb by the arms. Caleb was not cooperating with being held, which was evident from the state of the man holding him, who was bleeding from his nose and breathing with the careful effort of someone who has recently had the wind knocked out of him. The other 2 men were positioned to prevent exactly the kind of thing Caleb was clearly intending to do, which was get free and do further damage. The 3rd man, the one standing apart, watching with the calm of someone supervising rather than participating, was not someone she recognized. Not Hatch. Not Croft's 2 regulars. Someone new, which meant Croft had brought in people from outside the valley, people without local connections or local hesitation. That told her something important about how seriously Croft was taking what had happened in the church last night. She did not have a gun. She had a knife, and she had the dark at her back, and she had the particular resource of a person who has nothing left to lose from being underestimated. She picked up the largest stone she could find at the tree line and threw it hard into the brush 20 feet to the left of the men. Every head turned toward the sound. "Federal Marshal!" she shouted from the darkness. Nobody move, it was a lie. She was not a federal marshal. She had no authority and no backup, and the stone in the brush was a stone in the brush. But she shouted it with absolute conviction into the darkness where no one could see her, and the 3 men did what people do when they are surprised by authority they cannot immediately disprove. They hesitated. That was enough. Caleb used the hesitation the way a man uses a tool he has been waiting for completely and without any wasted motion. He broke the grip on his left arm, turned into the man on his right, drove an elbow into the man's jaw, with a crack she could hear from the tree line, and stepped clear of both of them before they'd finished reacting. The supervising man reached into his coat. "Don't," Lily said. She stepped out of the tree line into the firelight, and she held the knife in front of her and kept her voice at exactly the volume and register she'd used to say, "Get off my porch" 14 days ago. "You are not a marshal, and neither am I, and we both know it. But I have 21 signed names on a federal complaint that is already in Helena, and whatever you do to us tonight becomes part of that complaint by morning." Is that the instruction Croft gave you? To make this worse for him? The supervising man's hand was still inside his coat. The two men on the ground were deciding whether to get up. Caleb was standing between her and all three of them, completely still, with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to a man who has decided exactly what he will do if the next moment goes wrong, and is simply waiting to see if it does. The supervising man took his hand out of his coat. "Empty, this isn't finished," he said. "No," Lily agreed. "But tonight it is. Get your men and go." They went. She stood very still until the sound of the horses had faded completely down the mountain trail. Then she exhaled. Then she turned to look at Caleb, who was looking back at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something that was past surprise, and not quite arrived at the thing that comes after surprise. "Federal marshal," he said, "it worked. You could have been shot. I could have stayed home and let them burn your forge and put you in a ditch somewhere outside the valley." She put the knife away. "I didn't want to do that." He was quiet for a moment. The burning leaned to cracked and settled behind him, throwing orange light across his face. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "No." "The horse? Loose somewhere." "She'll come back." He looked at what remained of the lean-to. 4 years of finished work gone. The tools inside it salvageable, maybe, from the stone forge. But the woodwork, the frames, the stored orders, ash. He looked at it with the steady gaze of a man who is taking inventory of a loss and deciding in real time how much weight to give it. "I'm sorry," Lily said. "Don't be." He turned away from the lean-to and faced her. "This is what cornered men do. It means we're close. It means we need to move faster than close." She looked at the trail behind her. "How long before they report back to Croft?" "An hour. Maybe less. And Croft will know the intimidation didn't work and the fire didn't work. And he has a federal inspector coming and 21 complainants, and a newspaper letter on the way to Billings." She thought through it fast. He has one move left. He runs. Or he burns everything before he runs. "Not your lean-to. The county records office." She held his eyes. "If he destroys the current records, the altered ones, then there's nothing to compare the originals against. The case becomes harder." Caleb moved before she'd finished the sentence, back toward the stone forge, and she followed him inside. He went to the wall behind the coal storage and brought out the wooden toolbox she'd thought the documents were at Mrs. Teller's, and they were the originals. But there was something else in the box, something she hadn't seen before, and he spread it on the workbench under the lamp. Survey field notes, handwritten, dated going back 7 years. Not copies of county records, his own working notes from the 14 years he'd spent as a surveyor, including 2 seasons he had spent in this exact valley before he'd left the profession and come back as a blacksmith. "You surveyed this valley," she said. "Parts of it. 7 years ago, before Croft's operation started." He spread the notes across the bench. "These are independent third-party survey records. They predate every alteration. They have no connection to the county records office. If Croft burns the county building tonight, these still exist, and they still show what every boundary line looked like before anyone touched them." She stared at the notes. "Why didn't you show me these before?" "Because I didn't want to use them unless I had to. They establish that I surveyed this valley. Once that's known, Croft has a reason to target me specifically, not just as someone standing near you." His voice was level. "Now he has that reason anyway, so the notes might as well be useful." She looked at him, at the man who had been thinking 3 moves ahead, since before she'd walked into his forge, and felt something shift in how she understood him. Not what she'd thought was careful passivity, but strategic patience, the kind that costs something to maintain. "You have been protecting yourself," she said. "Specifically, deliberately. I've been protecting the evidence." He met her eyes. "Myself is secondary. It isn't to me." The words came out before she decided to say them. She didn't take them back. He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp between them threw steady light on the workbench and the notes and both their faces. "We need to get these to a third location," he said, not avoiding what she'd said, setting it aside. Carefully, for a moment, "That wasn't this one. Somewhere neither of us has been connected to publicly." "Dune," she said immediately. "The miner. He's outside town, he signed the complaint, and Croft doesn't know his connection to me yet." "Do you know where he lives?" "Clara does." "Then we need Clara." The next 4 hours moved fast and without pause. Clara, woken at 2 in the morning by Lily's knock at Henning's side door, accepted the task with the equanimity of a 17-year-old who has apparently been quietly outraged about the situation in Raven Hollow for longer than any adult had noticed. She took the field notes wrapped in oilcloth and set off toward Dune's property with the confident purposefulness of a person who knows every back path in a valley because she has spent years being the one sent on errands. Lily and Caleb went to the county records office, not to break in, not to take anything, to watch. They positioned themselves separately on opposite sides of the building in the pre-dawn dark. If Croft sent men to destroy the records, they would see it happen, and if they saw it happen, it would be witnessed, and witnessed destruction of official county records was obstruction of justice, compounded by arson, which was a criminal matter that operated on an entirely different level than a civil land dispute. They waited 2 hours. Nothing happened. At 4:30 in the morning, when the sky was beginning to show the first gray suggestion of intention toward dawn, Lily crossed to Caleb's side of the building. "He's not coming," she said quietly. "He decided it was too visible. Or he has a different plan." They looked at each other. Two people in the dark outside a county records building at 4:30 in the morning, having stopped an arson that may or may not have been about to happen, working through the question of what a cornered man with money and connections and a great deal to lose was going to do next. "He's going to try to get ahead of the federal complaint," Caleb said. "File his own version first. Claim the documents are forged. Claim we're the ones who committed fraud. Try to muddy the investigation before Webb gets here enough that Webb can't tell the clean story from the dirty one." Can he do that? He can try. Whether Webb believes it depends on whether Webb is competent and honest. And if Webb is neither, then we have the Billings Gazette. And if the Gazette doesn't run it, then we have 21 names and we go to the next paper. And the next. His voice was quiet and absolutely certain. "He can delay this, Lily. He cannot stop it. There are too many people, too many copies, too many directions it's moving in. He had one moment where he could have stopped it the night before the church meeting, and he missed it." She breathed the cool pre-dawn air of Raven Hollow and believed him. Not because she had decided to believe him, because the evidence supported it. "Go home," she said. "Sleep. Actually sleep. Not whatever you've been doing at Henning's house that doesn't count as sleep. What about you?" "I'm going to my house, my land." She looked up at the sky beginning its slow lightening. "In about 3 hours I'm going to be visible and calm, and doing normal things in full view of anyone who's watching, because I want Croft to see that last night didn't change anything for me. It's a considerable performance for 3 hours of sleep. I've been performing considerable things on no sleep for 2 weeks." She almost smiled. "I'm getting good at it." She walked home. She slept for 2 hours and 40 minutes and woke up determined. 3 days passed. 3 days that felt like 3 weeks, measured in small events and careful watching. Croft did not come to her property. Hatch did not appear. The rider, who had been watching her fence line, was gone, replaced, she thought, by something less visible, which was somehow more unnerving. On the second day, Frank Aldro came to see her. He arrived on foot, which was deliberate. A man arriving on horseback can be tracked and noted, and Frank Aldro had apparently made a decision about the value of being trackable. He came around the back and knocked at the kitchen door, and accepted coffee, and sat down across from her, with the expression of a man who has resolved his arithmetic, and doesn't like the sum, but has accepted it. He said, "I told her last night. All of it." A pause. "She's angrier than I am. Good. She wants to know if there's something more she can do. Can she write? Better than me. Tell her to write down everything she witnessed about the Henderson situation. Everything she personally observed, conversations, dates, anything specific. Signed statement witnessed by Henning. Send it to me." Lily wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Personal testimony from a neighbor who observed a family under duress is different from survey documentation. It puts human experience on the record. Aldro nodded. He drank his coffee. Then he looked at her across the table with the careful, honest expression of a man saying something he has worked up to. "I should have acted sooner," he said. "When the Hendersons were going through it, I knew something was wrong. I told myself it wasn't my fight. It's your fight now." "Yes," he set his cup down. "I'd like to make sure the Hendersons know that. Talk to Martha Henderson." She signed. "She'll want to hear it from you directly." He left with the slightly lighter step of a man who has put down something he was carrying and found that the remaining weight is manageable. On the third day, the telegram came. It arrived at the post office, addressed to Lily Calloway, which meant Pryor received it before. She did, and Croft had its contents before she did, and there was nothing to be done about that except acknowledge it and move forward. She picked it up at the counter with Pryor watching her face, and she read it without any change in her expression, and she thanked him politely and left. She read it again outside. It was from Aldous Webb's office in Helena. Federal land inspection scheduled. Inspector Webb arrives Raven Hollow Tuesday next. All complainants should be available for interview. Original documentation must be present and accounted for. This office takes reported violations of the Homestead Act and associated territorial land statutes with the utmost seriousness. Signed, Office of the Federal Land Inspector, Monte Territory. Tuesday, 4 days, she went directly to Caleb's forge. He was working, really working. The first real work she'd seen him do since the burning of the lean-to. As if the act of returning to the iron was itself a statement about what last week had and had not managed to accomplish. He looked up when she came in and read her face the way he always did, quickly and accurately. She handed him the telegram. He read it. Something happened in his face that she had not seen before. Not relief, he was not a man who performed relief. Something quieter. The expression of a person who has been holding something up for a very long time and has just been told they can set it down soon. 4 days, she said. 4 days. He handed the telegram back. "We need every document accounted for and organized before Tuesday morning. Every complainant ready to speak. Every piece of testimony written and signed." She folded the telegram. "Croft knows too. He got this before I did. Then whatever he's going to do, he'll do in the next 4 days. Yes. So we spend those 4 days making sure there's nothing left for him to do." He set down his hammer. "I want to visit every person who signed. Personally. Explain what to expect from the federal interview. Make sure they haven't been approached or pressured since the meeting. I'll come with you, half each," he said. "We cover more ground separately. Meet back here tonight." She was already moving toward the door. "Lily." She stopped. He was looking at her with the expression he'd had at the workbench in the lamplight, the one that had been set aside for a moment that wasn't then. She understood that he was not certain this was that moment either, but that the next 4 days were going to be what they were, and there were things that should be said before they became things that were almost said. "When this is over," he said carefully. "When Webb has come and gone and the investigation is open and Croft is answering questions he cannot control the answers to." He stopped. Tried again. "I don't want you to think that my involvement in this was about the surveys, or my father's farm, or any reason that has to do with anything except Caleb." She turned to face him fully. "I know why you're involved." He looked at her. "I know," she said again quietly. "Clearly, and I'd like to talk about it after Tuesday." He held her gaze for a moment. "After Tuesday," he said. She went out the door and into the morning and began the work of the next 4 days. She visited 11 people in 2 days. Each conversation was different, because each person was different. Different fears, different stakes, different amounts of pressure they'd received since signing their names in the church. 3 of them had been approached. Not by Croft directly, not even by Hatch, but by neighbors with advice in the form of concern. The kind of concern that sounds friendly and is a message. The message was, reconsider. None of them had. Martha Henderson looked at Lily across her kitchen table and said, "My children watched their father build something and then watched someone take it with a piece of paper. I am not reconsidering. They will understand someday that I was not the kind of woman who reconsiders." Dune. When Lily rode out to his property and found him cutting wood with the focused energy of a man who has been waiting for purpose, handed her back the oilcloth bundle of field notes and said, "Webb's going to want these in original condition. I wrapped them in an extra layer. They've been next to my stove, which is the driest spot on my property." Frank Aldro's wife Ellen, mid-30s, with capable hands and a schoolteacher's precise way of speaking, pressed 5 pages of written testimony into Lily's hands and said, I also wrote down what I observed about 2 other families who didn't make it to the meeting. I don't know if it helps. I thought it might. It helped enormously. Caleb visited the remaining 10. He came back the second evening with 11 pages of additional notes, and the information that 2 people he'd visited had been followed on their way home from the church meeting, and that both of them had noticed, and both of them had gone home. Anyway, and that fact, he said quietly, was the most important thing he'd learned in 2 days. They were followed, Lily said, and they went home anyway. He spread his notes on the forge workbench. Croft is trying to measure how frightened people are. He's sending watchers to follow complainants home, looking for signs of wavering, signs that the pressure is working. And nobody is wavering, because they've already crossed the line. You sign your name to a federal complaint, you're committed. There's no version of backing down that doesn't feel like losing twice. Exactly. He's going to understand that soon, and then he's going to make a different calculation. What calculation? She looked at the organized documents spread across the bench: surveys, ledger copies, field notes, signed testimonies, the federal telegram, 21 complaint signatures, a case that had started as one widow's resistance and had become something with weight and substance and too many pieces to destroy. He's going to calculate whether it's better to face the investigation or disappear before it arrives, she said. The possibility sat between them for a moment. If he runs, Caleb started. If he runs, the case is easier, and the people in this valley are safer, but nobody is held accountable. The land he's taken doesn't automatically come back. The altered records don't automatically get corrected. She shook her head. I don't want him to run. I want him to face Webb. I want everything he's done documented and adjudicated, and on a public record that cannot be unmade. Then we need to give him a reason to stay. She looked at him. What reason does a guilty man have to stay? The belief that he can still win. Caleb's voice was careful and deliberate. If Croft thinks the case against him is solid enough that he can't beat it, and weak enough that he might, he runs. If he thinks there's a path to discrediting the complaint and coming out intact, he stays and fights. He paused. We need him to believe there's a weakness in our case. A weakness we control, a weakness we invented. She understood. We let him find something, she said slowly. Something that looks like a flaw in the documentation. Something that looks like it might unravel the case. Just enough to make him think he has a chance. Just enough to make him file his own counter-evidence, hire a lawyer, commit to contesting the investigation publicly. He looked at her steadily. Once he's committed to contesting it publicly, he can't disappear. He's on record. What do we give him? One of the survey copies. Not an original one of my handmade copies from the first night. Slightly different than the originals in a way that a careful examination would show. He picked up a pen. I make a small error in a coordinate notation, deliberately. The kind of error that looks like a hasty forgery to someone who knows what to look for. And Pryor finds it. Pryor is looking at everything we do. We let him find the copy. He takes it to Croft. Croft's lawyer looks at it and says there's an inconsistency. Croft decides he can win. And when Webb arrives and compares the alleged forgery to the originals are perfect. The inconsistency in the copy becomes evidence of nothing except that someone made a hurried copy of a genuine document. He set the pen down. The trap is showing Croft a gap that isn't there. Lily looked at him for a long moment. This was a different kind of thinking than surveys and ledgers. This was the thinking of a man who has been watching and waiting for a very long time and knows how a particular kind of man reasons under pressure. You've been planning this, she said. Not the specific details, but this kind of move. I've been thinking about what I would do if I were Croft and I saw the case forming against me. A pause. I've had 15 years to think about what I would have needed to stop the man who took my family's farm. She picked up the pen. Show me where to put the error. Pryor found it the next afternoon. They had placed the copy where Pryor would find it in the general store. In the exchange of papers that accompanied a routine transaction, slipped into a stack of documents that Lily had been carrying openly for 2 days as part of her visible preparation for Webb's arrival. The switch happened while she was distracted by a question from Mrs. Teller, which was performed. And Pryor's hand moved the way a hand moves when it has been told to move. She did not see him take it. She only knew it was gone when she counted the stack outside the store. That evening, through the window of the saloon, she saw Hatch leave quickly. Heading toward the land office, she went to Caleb's forge. He has it, she said. Good. He was working at the anvil, steady and unhurried, and he set the hammer down and looked at her. Now we wait for Monday. If he doesn't take the bait, he'll take it. Caleb's voice was certain. A man who has spent 4 years engineering outcomes is not built for surrender. He'll look at that document, and he'll see a crack, and he'll believe he can make it wider. That's who he is. Monday arrived with a stillness over Raven Hollow that had nothing to do with weather. By noon the news had moved through the town in the quiet way that news moves in small places from person to person, shop to doorstep to fence line, without announcement. Silas Croft had filed a formal counter-complaint with the county court. He had retained a lawyer from Billings. He was contesting the federal complaint on the grounds that key documents were of questionable authenticity. He was staying. He was going to fight. Lily got the news from Clara, who heard it from Mrs. Teller, who had heard Hatch talking in tones he thought were private at the back of the feed store. She was standing in her own kitchen when she heard it, and she set down the cup she was holding, and pressed both hands flat on the table, and felt something move through her that was complicated and necessary, and beyond any single word for it. He was staying. That meant Tuesday mattered. That meant Webb would arrive, and Croft would be there, and the whole of what they had built, the surveys, and the field notes, and the testimonies, and the 21 names would be laid out in front of a federal inspector, who would determine whether justice in Raven Hollow was going to mean something, or whether it was going to mean the same thing it always had, which was whatever Silas Croft needed it to mean. She walked to the forge. Caleb was organizing the documents into the order Webb's office had specified: original surveys first, corroborating records second, personal testimonies third, federal correspondence last. He had a methodical system, and he was executing it with the focused precision of a man doing the most important work of his professional life, which it was. She sat down across the bench from him and began helping. They worked through the afternoon, and into the evening, side by side at the stone workbench, the forge coals warm at their backs, the documents building into something that told a complete and irrefutable story of what had been done to the families of Raven Hollow. At some point, Mrs. Teller arrived with food she set down without comment. At some point, Henning came and sat in the corner with his hands folded and said nothing, which was its own form of company. At some point, the evening settled fully into night, and they lit the lamps and kept working. Lily looked at the organized stack of documents and thought about the night she'd first opened the survey bundle at her kitchen table, the woman she'd been then, alone with the lamp and the growing understanding of what she was holding. She thought about how far it was from that woman to this room, this table, these people. She thought about Tuesday. "We're ready," she said. Caleb looked at the stack, at her. "Yes," he said simply. "We are." Outside Raven Hollow was quiet the way a place is quiet before something that matters. The mountains held their watch. The valley lets its nighttime patience. And tomorrow one more day, one more night, and then a federal inspector would ride into this town, and everything that Silas Croft had built on would have to face a reckoning that all his lawyers and all his judges and all his careful, quiet document alterations could not prevent. Lily Calloway had arrived in this valley as a widow with a broken promise and a kitchen table and a fury she did not yet know what to do with. She was still furious, but now she had something to do with it. And she was not done yet. And she was not done yet, not by a long measure, because Tuesday morning arrived with the particular weight of a day that has been coming for a long time and knows it. Aldous Webb rode into Raven Hollow at 8:30. He was not what Lily had expected, though she had tried not to expect anything specific, because expectation was a luxury she couldn't afford this week. He was perhaps 50, compact and deliberate in his movements, with the kind of face that has been out on the altar for so long that it has stopped registering surprise at conditions. He wore a federal inspector's credentials on his coat, and carried a leather case that looked like it had been opened in a great many difficult situations, and had never once failed to be taken seriously. He came directly to the church, which was where they had agreed to conduct the proceedings, because the church was the largest neutral space in Raven Hollow, and because Henning had offered it without hesitation, and because there was something appropriate about conducting this particular reckoning in a place that was technically not under anyone's jurisdiction except a higher authority than Silas Croft. Lily was already there when Webb arrived. So was Caleb, standing to her left with the organized document stack in a leather case of his own 14 years of professional habit. The right container for the right occasion. So was Henning, and Mrs. Teller, and Frank Aldro, and Martha Henderson, and Dune, and 16 other people who had signed their names to something they believed in and had come to see it through. Webb looked at the room, at the people, at the documents on the table. He set his own case down beside theirs, opened it, and took out a notebook. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I've read your complaint. I have some questions." "Ask them," she said. What followed was 3 hours of the most focused and demanding conversation Lily had ever been part of. Webb was thorough, in the way that a man is thorough when he understands that the difference between a closed case and an open one is frequently a detail that someone assumed was too small to matter. He went through the surveys document by document, asking Caleb to walk him through the survey methodology, the reference markers, the notation system, the comparison between what the originals showed and what the current county records contained. Caleb answered every question in the clear, patient language of a man who spent 14 years explaining technical information to people who needed to act on it and learned that precision and clarity are not opposites. Webb listened with the complete attention of someone who is building something in his mind and needs every piece to be exactly the right shape. At the end of the first hour, he set down his pen and looked at Caleb directly. "You made these copies yourself." "When?" 7 years ago. Before the first recorded alteration in the Marsh property file. "Can you prove that?" "The paper stock and ink composition can be tested against dated samples from the same period. I kept several documents from that year that can serve as comparison." Caleb's voice was steady. "I can also provide the names of 3 individuals who saw me working on the survey copies at the time. 2 are present in this room." Webb looked at the 2 people Caleb indicated with a slight nod. Then he made a note. "Continue," he said. "Croft's lawyer arrived at 10 o'clock. His name was Beaumont Billings Firm, expensive suit, the polished confidence of a man who has won difficult cases by making complexity his ally and simplicity his opponent. He came in with 2 clerks carrying their own document cases, and took a position at the far end of the table from Lily and Caleb, with the settled authority of someone who has decided that the geography of the room is part of the argument. Croft himself came in behind them. He looked at Lily. She looked back at him. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say in that moment that wasn't already being said by everything else in the room. Webb acknowledged Beaumont with a brief professional nod. "Counselor, you represent Mr. Croft's interests?" "I do, and I'd like to formally object to the conduct of this proceeding on the grounds that the complainants have been allowed to organize and present a coordinated narrative without." "This is a federal land inspection," Webb said, "not a trial. The procedure is mine to determine." He looked at Beaumont with the calm of a man who has been objected to before and found it instructive rather than persuasive. "You'll have full opportunity to present your client's position and challenge the complainant's documentation. We'll proceed in the order I've established." Beaumont sat down. His face showed nothing. He was good at his job. That was fine. So was Webb. Lily kept her hands flat on the table and breathed. The counter-complaint came at noon. Beaumont stood and laid out Croft's position, with the structured efficiency of someone who has rehearsed this presentation and refined it based on what he'd observed in the morning session. The complainant's surveys were copies of uncertain provenance. The original county records showed no evidence of alteration. Any discrepancies were the result of legitimate resurveys conducted under proper authority. The lead complainant, Mrs. Calloway, had a clear personal interest in disputing the county's deed review. The man who produced the primary documentation, Anderson, was a blacksmith with a stated personal grievance against land institutions dating back 15 years, which raised serious questions about motivation and bias. It was good. Lily had to acknowledge that it was good. It was the kind of argument that worked when the audience was a local judge, who had reasons of his own to find it persuasive. Webb was not that audience. He waited until Beaumont finished. Then he opened the document case and produced the copy, the one with the deliberate error, the one that Pryor had taken and delivered to Croft, and that Croft had apparently given to Beaumont as evidence of fabrication. "Counselor, is this the document your client characterizes as evidence of forgery?" Beaumont looked at it. "Yes. The coordinate notation in Section 3 is inconsistent with standards or practice and differs from the notation in the county's own records in a way that suggests. I'd like to compare it to the original." Webb held out his hand toward Caleb. Caleb produced the original survey. Clean, perfect. Notation in Section 3, exactly as it should be. Exactly as it had always been. Webb laid them side by side. He looked at them for a long moment. Then he looked at Beaumont. The inconsistency your client identified exists in one copy. Not in the original, not in any of the other copies. His voice was entirely neutral. What your client has presented as evidence of forgery is evidence that someone made a hurried copy that contained a transcription error. That is not the same thing. Beaumont's polished confidence did not collapse, but something in it compressed, adjusted. The point stands that copies of uncertain provenance. The point stands that the original surveys predate every recorded alteration in the county files by a minimum of 2 years. Webb set both documents down. That's what matters, counselor. Silence. Croft at the far end of the table was looking at the two documents laid side by side. Lily watched him look at them. She watched the moment when he understood what he was seeing, not just the comparison of two papers, but the shape of the trap he had walked into. The copy with the error had been bait. He had taken it. And in taking it, he had committed to contesting the investigation publicly, which meant he was here, on the record, in a room with a federal inspector who was now looking at him with the particular quality of attention that federal inspectors develop when a case stops being complicated and becomes clear. Croft looked up from the documents and met Lily's eyes. She held his gaze. She did not feel triumphant. She felt something quieter and more durable than triumph. She felt the particular satisfaction of a woman who was promised nothing and built everything anyway, and who was watching that building hold its weight. The afternoon session was testimony. One by one, the people of Raven Hollow sat across from Aldous Webb and told him what they knew. Not performance reel telling. The kind that comes from people who have been carrying something too long and are finally being asked to set it down somewhere official. Martha Henderson described the water rights, the boundary change, the year her husband worked the northern acres, not knowing they were already being stolen from him on paper. Her voice stayed steady for most of it and then did not, and the part where it did not was the most important part because Webb wrote it down in full. Frank Aldro described what he had observed in his neighbor's situations and what he had failed to observe, and what he wished he had done sooner. He said the last part plainly, without asking for absolution, and Webb wrote that down too. Dune told his story in the clipped, specific language of a man who has processed his own experience down to the essential facts, because the surrounding feelings are still too large to manage in public. He said, "I sold because I thought I had a deed problem I couldn't prove wasn't real. I sold below value to get clear of something I didn't understand. I understand it now." He put a piece of paper on the table. "That's the sale price I accepted, and the assessed value 6 months earlier. The difference is $840. $840. In 1888. The room felt that number. Caleb testified last among the complainants. He spoke for 30 minutes in the careful, organized manner of a professional giving expert testimony, which is what it was. 14 years of survey experience applied to the specific question of what the documents showed, and what they proved, and why the alterations were not errors or resurveys, but deliberate falsifications executed with full knowledge of their effect. Webb asked 12 questions. Caleb answered all 12. The answers were complete, specific, and unambiguous. When Caleb finished, Webb closed his notebook. He looked at Beaumont. "Does your client wish to provide testimony?" Beaumont looked at Croft. A silent exchange happened, the exchange between a lawyer and a client. When the lawyer is communicating that the situation has changed, and the client is processing what that means. "My client declines to testify at this stage of the proceedings," Beaumont said. "Noted," Webb said. Webb spent the following hour reviewing documents alone at the table while everyone else waited in the church or just outside it. Lily stood near the door and watched the mountains hold their afternoon patience over the valley. Caleb stood beside her, and neither of them said much because there was nothing useful to say. And they had both learned over the past weeks that silence between two people who trust each other is not empty. Frank Aldro brought water from outside and distributed it without being asked, which was the kind of practical human grace that Lily had come to recognize as Raven Hollow's best quality, not its most visible quality, which had long been its capacity for fear, but its best one. Mrs. Teller sat with Martha Henderson and did not talk, just sat close, which was enough. Dune leaned against the wall with his arms crossed and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has done what he came to do and is prepared to wait for whatever comes of it. At 3:30, Webb called the room back to order. He stood at the head of the table, with his notebook open, and looked at the assembled faces of Raven Hollow with the expression of a man who has reached a conclusion and is choosing his words carefully, not because the conclusion is complicated, but because its consequences are significant and deserve to be treated that way. Based on my review of the documentation provided by the complainants and the counter-documentation provided by Mr. Croft's legal representation, he said, I am opening a formal federal investigation into systematic land deed fraud in the Raven Hollow district of Montana Territory. He paused. Let it settle. The original survey documentation demonstrates a clear pattern of boundary alteration across a minimum of 7 properties over a 4-year period. The internal records provided by complainants corroborate this pattern and indicate coordination rather than isolated error. The alterations show a consistent directional bias. Every change benefits a single acquiring party, which is Mr. Croft's various business entities. He looked at Beaumont. I want every county record touching properties in this valley held in place as of this morning. No alterations, no transfers, no new deed filings until this investigation is complete. That is a federal order, and it carries federal penalties for non-compliance. Beaumont wrote something down. His face was professional and revealed nothing. But Croft's face revealed something just for a moment, just the briefest compression of a man absorbing the reality of what is happening to the plan he has spent 4 years building. And Lily saw it, and she filed it away not as victory but as fact. Additionally, Webb continued, I am recommending to my office that original deed status be provisionally restored for all properties where alteration can be documented, pending full investigation. That means the altered boundaries affecting your properties are suspended as of today. He looked at the room. Your landlines go back to the originals until this is resolved. Martha Henderson made a sound. A real one. Not controlled or performed, just the sound of a woman receives something she had stopped letting herself want. Lily pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed through it. Mr. Croft Webb looked at the far end of the table. You will receive formal notification of the investigation scope within 10 days. I strongly advise you to cooperate fully with your legal representation in responding to that notification. A pause. I also strongly advise you not to leave the territory. Croft's lawyer put a hand on his arm. Croft said nothing. He stood and straightened his coat and walked out of the church without looking at Lily, or at Caleb, or at any of the people who had given testimony today. He walked out with the dignity of a man who still believes that the story is not finished, which was true. The investigation would take months. The legal process would be long and contested, and there would be hard days still to come. But he walked out of Raven Hollow's church on a Tuesday afternoon, having lost the thing he could least afford to lose, which was the certainty that he could not be stopped. The door swung shut behind him. The room stayed very quiet for a moment. Then Frank Aldro said, Lord Almighty. And then the room was not quiet anymore. Webb stayed 2 more days, taking additional statements and organizing the federal file with the methodical care of a man who understands that how a case is documented at the beginning determines whether it holds its shape all the way through to the end. He treated every person who came to speak with the same attention he had given Lily and Caleb, which was the thing she appreciated most about him, not his competence, though he was competent, but his consistency. He made no one feel that their piece of the story was smaller than anyone else's. On his second evening in Raven Hollow, he stopped by the church where Lily and Caleb were organizing the copies of documentation that Webb's office would retain. Mrs. Calloway. He stood at the door with his hat in his hands. I want to tell you something that's not in my official report. She looked at him. I've done 14 inspections in this territory in the last 6 years. 3 of them involved systematic fraud of this type. He chose his words with care. In the other 2 cases, the complaint came after the damage was complete. Properties lost, families gone, nothing left to restore. In those cases, all I could do was document what had happened. He paused. This is the first time I've arrived while the damage is still being done. The first time there's something left to protect. He looked at her steadily. That's because you moved when you did, the way you did. She received that in silence for a moment. I had help, she said. I know, I've noted everyone's contributions. He put his hat back on. But someone has to be first. You were first, he went out. Caleb had been listening from the other side of the table. He did not say anything immediately, and she didn't expect him to. What Webb had said was real, and it deserved a moment of quiet before anything else was put on top of it. Then Caleb said, "He's right. I tore a piece of paper in half," she said. "That's where it started." No, he looked at her. "It started before that. It started when they came to your porch, and you decided that what they were doing had a name and the name was wrong." He set down the document he was holding. A lot of people know when something is wrong. Not all of them decide to say so. She looked at him across the table, at the man who took hers for 15 years, and waited for the right moment, and recognized it when it walked through his forge door, in a coat that smelled like mountain air and fury. "You said we'd talk," she said, "after Tuesday. It's Wednesday." "It is." He came around the table, not hurried, not performing the moment. Just a man moving towards something he had decided on, in his deliberate, unhurried way, with the same purposefulness he brought to everything that mattered. He stood in front of her, close enough that she could see the iron dust in the collar of his coat, and the tiredness around his eyes from 2 weeks of work that had not stopped for anything. "I have been alone for a long time," he said, "by choice, because I decided it was easier than the alternative." He paused. "I was wrong about that. I know I was wrong about it because for the past 2 weeks I have not felt alone. And the difference is significant enough that I can't pretend it isn't. Caleb, let me not urgent, just certain. I am not asking you for anything you're not ready to give. I am not asking you to make decisions about the future before the future is clear enough to see. I am asking you only to know that what I feel when I am in the same room as you is not gratitude or admiration or professional respect, though it is all of those things too." He held her gaze. "It is the specific feeling of a man who has found the person he did not believe he was still looking for." The church was quiet around them. The afternoon light came through the windows at the angle it always came through, indifferent to human significance, which was its own kind of honesty. Lily looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Daniel not with grief, which was where she'd lived for the first week, but with the particular love of a woman for a man who had taught her what partnership was supposed to feel like so that she would recognize it again if she was lucky enough to encounter it a second time. Daniel would have liked Caleb Anderson. She was certain of that. Daniel had always respected a person who kept what mattered and waited until the right moment, and then did not waste it. "I am not ready to make decisions about the future," she said. "You're right about that, I know. But I am ready to stop pretending that working beside you for the last 2 weeks has felt like nothing." She held his gaze. "Because it has felt like something considerable. And I am not a woman who pretends otherwise." Something in his face opened the rest of the way the last door. The one that had been almost open for days, coming fully off its hinges with the quiet inevitability of a thing that was always going to happen and was simply waiting for the right words. He reached out and took her hand. She let him. They stood like that in the church for a moment. Two people who had come through something hard and come through it together and were standing on the other side of it, not at an ending, but at a beginning, which was not what either of them had expected from this season of their lives, and which was, for that reason, more valuable than anything either of them could have planned for. The investigation lasted 8 months. Beaumont fought every stage of it with the professional stubbornness of a lawyer who has been paid to fight and intends to earn the fee. There were delays and counterfilings, and 3 separate attempts to have the original documentation ruled inadmissible on procedural grounds, all of which Webb handled with the same patient thoroughness he had brought to Raven Hollow on a Tuesday morning in the summer of 1888. Garrett Finch came back from Billings. He came back because Lily wrote to him a letter, plain and direct, telling him that the case was real and the protection was real, and that his testimony was the piece that would make the difference between a strong case and an unassailable one. He sat across from Webb for 4 hours and told everything he knew about the records office operations, every conversation he'd overheard, every document he'd seen changed, every instruction he'd been in, and the name of the man who gave it. The Billings Gazette ran the story in October. 3 columns, front page, with a headline that named Croft directly and described the federal investigation in terms that left nothing ambiguous. The editor had sat on the letter Lily had sent until the investigation was far enough along to be bulletproof, and then he ran it in full. 3 other papers picked it up. In November, 2 of the families who had sold under pressure, including the Petersons, whose land Frank Aldro had recognized in the survey documents, filed their own complaints with Webb's office. They had read the Gazette story in the towns they'd retreated to, And they had understood for the first time that what had happened to them had a name, and that the name was being spoken out loud by a federal inspector in Montana Territory. The case was no longer a valley dispute. It was a territorial matter. In January, Silas Croft's lawyer negotiated a settlement that Croft accepted because the alternative was criminal prosecution on fraud and obstruction charges that carried sentences no amount of money would comfortably insulate him from. The settlement required the restoration of original deed boundaries for all affected properties, restitution payments calculated from the original property valuations, and the permanent revocation of Croft's right to conduct land business in Montana Territory. He left Raven Hollow in February, quietly, without announcement, in the manner of a man who has calculated that there is nothing left here worth staying for. Gerald Hatch left the same week. Pryor resigned from the post office. The records office hired 2 new clerks under federal oversight protocols that Webb's investigation had put in place. Martha Henderson got her water rights back. The Peterson family came back in the spring not to farm. They had made a different life, but to see the land and stand on it and let their children put their hands in the creek that still ran exactly where it had always run, where the granite marker still stood that Hatch had told Lily did not exist. She had known it existed. She had known it the way you know something when you have been told a lie by someone who underestimated how carefully you had been paying attention. The forge lean-to was rebuilt in March. Caleb built it himself, with help he didn't ask for and received anyway. Frank Aldro showed up one morning with lumber and his oldest son and no explanation beyond "we're here," and Dune showed up an hour later with tools. And by the end of 2 days the lean-to was standing better than the original because 4 people had built it instead of 1. Lily brought food both days, not because she had to, not because it was expected, but because she was there and she wanted to be there, and she had learned, in the particular school of the last several months, that wanting to be somewhere and being there are 2 things that should always, when possible, be allowed to be the same thing. On the second evening, when the work was done and Aldro and Dune had gone home, and the forge had been lit for the first time since the burning, she sat on a stool at the workbench and watched Caleb work the first iron of the new season. The sound of it was what she had come to think of as the sound of something true, direct and purposeful, and completely without pretense. "I've been thinking," she said. He kept the hammer moving. About the northern acres. The ones the investigation restored. She folded her hands. "The soil up there is good for a kitchen garden and an orchard if someone knows what they're doing. Daniel never got to it. He meant to. That's a significant amount of work for one person." "I know," he held his gaze. "I wasn't planning to do it alone." The hammer came down once more, and then was still. He turned and looked at her, the full direct look of a man who does not waste this kind of moment by misunderstanding it. "Is that an offer or a question?" "Both," she said, in that order. He set the hammer down on the anvil with the deliberate care of someone putting down one thing in order to pick up something else. He came to the workbench and stood across from her and looked at her the way he'd looked at the survey bundle the first day she'd asked him about it, assessing the weight of it, understanding what he was being offered and what it would require, and deciding, with the full and clear-eyed honesty of a man who has spent 15 years being careful about what he committed to, that this was worth it. "Yes," he said, "not to the orchard, not just to the northern acres, to all of it." To the future she was describing in the only language that mattered, which was the plain and practical language of 2 people, talking about what they intended to build together. She stood up. "Spring planting starts in 6 weeks, she said. "We'll need to assess the soil before we order stock. I know something about soil assessment." "I know you do." She picked up her coat, moved toward the door, stopped and looked back at him, standing in his forge with his hands that had held iron and surveys. And the weight of 15 years of a particular kind of waiting. And she let herself feel the full significance of this moment without managing or containing it, because she had earned the right to feel it completely. "Come to dinner tonight," she said. "At my house, my land." The land they didn't take. The land they didn't take, she agreed. 7 o'clock. She walked out into the March evening with the cold still in the air, but something underneath it, the particular quality of cold that is thinning at the edges, that is becoming something else, that carries in it the first suggestion of a season turning. She walked home through the valley of Raven Hollow, past the places where things had happened and the places where things had not happened, and the fence lines, that were now correctly drawn, and the creek that still ran to the granite marker, that still stood exactly where it had always stood. She had come here with a broken promise and no plan. She was leaving the road for her own front gate with 21 names on a federal record and a blacksmith coming to dinner at 7 o'clock and 80 acres of Montana land that belonged to her, clearly and legally and permanently, in a way that no one with a pen and a deed alteration and a patient plan to steal it was ever going to successfully challenge again. She had been promised safety by people who had no intention of providing it. She had built it herself, out of evidence and fury, and the particular grace of strangers who became something more than strangers when it mattered most. That was the story of Lily Calloway and Caleb Anderson, and the Valley of Raven Hollow in the summer and fall and winter of 1888, not a story about what was promised, but about what was fought for and kept and built and chosen. And some things once truly chosen do not come undone.